Hello, this is a Brighter Futures film, how research improves policy and changes lives. It's a great pleasure to welcome Jules Preston from the Department of Sociology. In this episode, we're going to be talking about disasters and emergency and preparedness. John, welcome. Your expertise is in disasters and emergencies, and particularly in the social inequalities of preparedness or non-preparedness. Could you just tell us a bit about your research then?
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Thanks for inviting me onto the show. My research is on disasters and emergencies and preparedness, and there's really two aspects to this research. The first aspect is to look at individuals and communities and their agency in disasters and emergencies. So basically how individuals respond, and actually trying to recognise, because it's often misrecognised, that people have a lot of agency and a lot of power to act for the benefit of their communities in disasters. So it's really to recognise that agency on the one hand. On the other hand, it's doing what is called policy sociology. So it's taking a really deep dive into the policy process, perhaps going into the archives, perhaps interviewing people from government or emergency planning authorities, and looking at how that process takes place, and looking at the disjuncture between how individuals and communities behave and how governments think that they might behave or conceive that they might behave, which is often completely at odds with the actual practice on the ground.
And so some of the disasters you've looked at have been iconic kind of problems that we've faced in the United Kingdom in the past. Aberfan, obviously Grenfell Tower more recently, Flixborough. Would you like to just kind of pick on some of the specifics of one or two of those to explain that kind of agency and culture of preparedness? Yeah,
I'll illustrate some of my points through those. So the Aberfan disaster, 21st of October 1966. So it was at the Aberfan colliery. What had actually happened was that there was a sort of coal detritus from mining, which had been built over a spring. That actually accelerated. It hit the local primary school, killing 116 children, 28 adults. And the kind of state response to the accident was it was impossible to predict that such a thing could occur. In the official report, the residents of Aberfan were described as being like moles thinking about the habits of birds. So completely unaware of what was happening, and said, well, this is the accumulated responsibility of generations coming back to them. So it's totally misrecognising the agency of the community. So in my research, I actually went to the archives in Swansea and the National Archives in London, and actually took a look into the inquiry and actually some of the official documents and also the interviews. And at the Swansea archives, actually the National Archives of Wales, it's a really great archive of children's diaries and stories about before and after the disaster.
So you track it through that kind of period.
So you can actually see what children were saying before. So children actually, were playing in the spring. They were talking to their parents about the water. The people at the colliery actually knew that it could be a disaster. The head teacher at the local primary school said to the local councillors, we'll be buried in this school because of the disaster. So they're actually foreshadowing what was going to happen. There was a lot of awareness in the community. And that was also true if we fast forward to 2017 of the Grenfell Tower disaster, that the Grenfell Action Group actually were aware of the problems at Grenfell Tower in the tower block. They were aware of the problems with the cladding. They were aware of the need for fire exits. They knew that there wasn't the possibility of evacuation. And they were consistently warning Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council of this. So communities know that something's going to happen. And even when they're not aware of a disaster happening, then as soon as it occurs, they really document and organise around the disaster. So in the Flixborough disaster, you mentioned, it's less well known. It was June 1974, an explosion at the Flixborough Nipro plant. It was actually owned by the National Coal Board again. 28 workers died. But the real extensive damage was done to the community, to the housing around that. And it was children and often parents who documented what had happened, who took the photographs, who took the films. So we actually can look back at Flixborough and say what's happened, and actually organised around the rebuilding of the housing. Now, if you take the perspective of government, on the side of government,
there's 50 years between Aberfan and Grenfell, so it is extraordinary, isn't it?
It sounds extraordinary, but what I'd stress is the continuity. So the fact that lessons aren't learned from disasters, that actually the agency and the information is in communities. And if we listen to communities more and we listen to individuals more, we can find out a lot more about what is actually going on in those communities. And actually what happens after disasters is that communities organise. So another project I was involved in, funded by the ESRC, was looking at critical infrastructure collapse. So what happens when electricity supplies collapse? What happens when there are major disasters cutting off infrastructure? And what we found from that is communities do organise, but in very different ways. And we identified 3 different ways. One we call navigation, which is just communities deal with things as they occur. And I think you saw that in the coronavirus pandemic. So people were just dealing with things as they happened, you know, in their households.
Literally navigating through it.
Yeah, they were just working their way around what was happening. The second one is conventional organisation. So communities come together, they organise and use their resources to handle the disaster. But the third way is reframing. So they actually not only look back at the disaster, but they look at the politics behind it, and they look at the social inequalities behind it which caused it. And in a lot of disasters now, you can see a reframing. So in Grenfell, we saw not only an identification, you know, that there was a disaster in the inquiry, but the community were very much looking at the causes of it, the racial inequalities, the class inequalities, the gentrification of the areas, and identifying those factors as some of the reasons why Grenfell Tower was perhaps ignored in terms of fire safety and other kinds of precautions.
So there are implications from this analysis for policy in terms of, as you described with Aberfan, there's a kind of a degree of element where governments don't want to take responsibility, or at least they want to say, well, it was down to you local people, in some sort of way, or at least not even listening to their kind of signals from beforehand. But we saw something similar with Grenfell, where actually the deeper structural inequalities in that part of London, in those kinds of residences, were part of the reason why it occurred.
That's it. So, I mean, my message to policymakers, and I do talk to civil contingencies in the Cabinet Office and to other policymakers I'm involved in their kind of discussions on preparedness for disasters, is to always listen to communities and to really leverage the community assets in terms of a response. So communities are often looked at as a problem by government. So in terms of, you know, social control, or in terms of what if there's looting, or what if there's crime, but that rarely occurs in disasters. Even when there's so-called looting, normally it's when communities have not got access to any resources and all the shops are closed, so they need to actually get some food or accommodation or whatever it actually might be. So yeah, that's been my message to policymakers in terms of, you know, you've got to listen to community voices, and that's quite hard. I mean, one of the other things I've seen in terms of how government makes decisions is what is called in sociology tacit intentionality. That is that government makes mistakes, but they're not overt mistakes. So it's not, you know, the government doesn't want to cause inequalities and it doesn't want to see disasters, but it neglects certain areas of society, and that means that when those disasters occur, it seems to be a complete surprise for government. So in terms of Grenfell Tower, if you look at the history of preparedness for fires, stay put has been a long-term government policy. I mean, I trace it right back to the Cold War, actually. So in the 1960s, it was decided that people, you know, really needed to stay put.
Stay put, and even if it's a nuclear explosion.
Nuclear war. In the 1980s, stay put in a tower
Okay.
block, which was ludicrous, was part of the policy in a major emergency. So this becomes part of policy, and Grenfell Tower was about compartmentalisation in terms of fire safety, whereas after 9/11, there was kind of a move towards evacuation and looking at tower block safety and looking at fitting sprinkler systems. But of course, that was only in the most high class tower blocks, as always. So they weren't looking at council properties, social housing, like Grenfell Tower. So there's kind of a systematic neglect. And because of the sort of people who work in government, it's a very hard message to give to policymakers, you know, but they come from a certain class, they come from a certain background, you know, it's very difficult sometimes to change those messages, but it can work in some cases, yeah.
So if we're thinking about, if we're looking forward in terms of kind of national risk assessments, being more prepared, as you would say, you know, for the things that are uncertain. There was a time when a major pandemic was top of the national risk assessment, but actually then decisions were made not to be ready for such a thing. So there are two parts of this. One is recognition and then one is acting. And I suppose that if we're looking forward, we would be concerned about disasters that might follow part of the climate crisis. You know, there could be a range of different kinds of things. And presumably that also is thinking about risk in different places, to different assets, to communities and so forth, and what we might do about it.
Yeah, well, government's more aware of disasters than we like to think, and they have a very different perspective on major, what I'd call existential threats, than we believe they have. A lot of planning goes on behind closed doors. And my research shows you can only really find out about that in retrospect. So again, the archives are our friend here. You can go to the National Archives and see how government actually planned for major disasters. I've looked extensively, for example, at preparation for nuclear war and government preparedness. And actually, a recent paper I've written looks at how academics thought that government thought about nuclear war and how government was actually thinking about it. So I've looked at the work of Stan Openshaw, who was an academic, I think, University of Leeds, and he was looking at public response to nuclear attack. And his view was Britain wasn't prepared. A nuclear attack in the 1980s would be incredibly devastating, and recovery would be very difficult. And he was consistently telling this message to government. This is actually quite a good story about impact and how, as academics, we think we're having an impact when we're not. So the government was definitely listening to Stan Openshaw in the 1980s. But what Stan Openshaw didn't know is that the government thought even a smaller nuclear attack on the UK would mean that the UK would not exist as a nation. There was a paper written in 1982 by the Home Office which said, small number of nuclear weapons on the UK would not function as a nation.
So government knew certain things, but kept them to themselves a little bit?
They do, yeah. Government's preparing for lots of stuff. Yeah. So in my more recent work, I'm really trying to open this up and say to government, look, you need to be transparent about your plans and preparedness, because that actually also helps communities to know what they're being prepared for. It also holds government to account as well.
So take this into your 2 or 3 top recommendations then from this research on past disasters, on the kind of cultures of preparing and not being prepared, and the different actors involved. So very complex kind of social territory. But looking at those, and particularly in the context of us having come through a kind of long 2-year one, almost kind of unprecedented, more like a war, I suppose.
Yes, the global pandemic.
Exactly. The 2 or 3 recommendations that you would make for policy.
So, I'm actually enacting some of those through my work on space weather at the moment. So I'm involved in a group called the Space Environment Impact Experts Group. We're an independent group. We inform government on space weather risks and the national risk assessment. We provide open scenarios for space weather solar flares, which would affect the Earth and cause huge damage to the electricity grid and telecommunications, etc. And through that, there's a few recommendations which I think can be generalised. First of all, transparency and openness is what we should see from the UK government. The UK is very different to other nations. So I've looked at Germany, USA, Japan, New Zealand. All of their plans for preparedness for pandemics, etc., completely open. You can walk into any German library and ask for the national pandemic plan, and they'll give it to you. UK, it's very secret. We don't know what the plans are. So transparency holds government to account. It helps citizens be aware. The second recommendation is you need to give people agency and you need to give people resources. So you actually need to allow people the freedom to make decisions. And some of the time in the coronavirus pandemic, because of the need to isolate, etc., we're perhaps shutting down things like mutual aid a bit too much and volunteering. So those things need to occur in a disaster and emergency. So my main 2 things would be government needs to be held to account, needs to be transparent, and give citizens the freedom and communities the freedom to act.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. John Preston, many thanks.
Thanks, Jules.
You've been watching a Brighter Futures film short. For more on how research impacts policy and changes people's lives, pop over to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.